For the rest of the videos, I just want to focus in on implementation specifically. And I actually posted a link to an implementation graphic organizer. So I'm going to switch over to that, and just know that you can download the same document if you want to look at it or print it while you're watching this video. So having done my dissertation on the implementation of response to intervention, one of the things that really comes out of the research, not just my own, but implementation research, and this is just a conceptual map to kind of give you some understanding. So typically there's this like state policy or framework around curriculum, okay? And it's typically informed by national. Now, at the time, it was IDEA and NCLB. If I was to update this graphic organizer, it would now have ESSA in here as well, right? And so those things influence the policies, it influences the frameworks that the states develop at a curriculum level, okay? So just go with me, because this is the start of where this process begins. So from the state, implementation of curriculum, or in this case a policy, goes to the district level, right? So in the state is giving district to choose implementation, and it's how the states typically articulate those messages down to districts through print resources. There's a ton of, whether it's digital or paper. They provide professional development at PTAN, which is Pennsylvania Training and Technical Education Network, and as well as IUs. And typically, when there's something really new at a state level, the IUs will consult with districts. But again, it's never mandated from the state. So from the district implementation, we see that the district will then often give the schools that information. So the schools in the districts then have the ability to articulate at the local level how the policies, curriculum get enacted upon at the school level. And so here, a lot of times districts will have the framework, they'll have a curriculum, but they'll really give some choice into how to best implement that in their schools. And they'll provide curriculum resources, staffing accordingly to the, however that's done. Typically there's budget allocation that the schools have. Sometimes the budget allocation is from a district level, especially for initial implementation, but nonetheless, there might be some wiggle room for the schools in terms of, getting more of something or less, or spending it to add on or to supplement the curriculum. Typically, there's assessments that come along with any new curriculum or policy, as well as professional development. And so then the schools then implement the curriculum, all right? So further down the line, then the schools give the messages to the teachers, right? In this case, with RTII, there was a plan, and typically there's a plan for implementation with a curriculum. There's professional development. There's usually a model for how the curriculum is going to be taught. In this case, there were interventions and resources allocated for that implementation. And then at the grade level, the teacher level, right, there's grade level teams working with curriculum or analyzing data or setting goals. And so the teachers then get that information, right? So then if you go back to the school implementation, you have to consider that there's variation in school leadership, right? That schools, for as much as they tend to be the same in a district, there is differences between schools. You'll have a school that qualifies for title services, whereas the other one has all high SES. And so right away, the demographics, the principal leadership and what the principal believes in, where they put their resources may be different. The climate and cultures of the school are very different. So all of that is going to influence how these teachers are really implementing, right? And then also there's this belief in efficacy of a program and a belief about student ability is going to influence how a teacher is going to implement something new. And of course, that belief system is influenced by their own knowledge, their knowledge of pedagogy, their experience, and any bias that they may have. And so then the teacher implements, and there's the set of instructional practices, right? And so we know that there are kind of these immediate outcomes, right? That students respond to the implementation of said curriculum, and kind of the kind of distal outcomes are this idea of student achievement. And of course, depending on what's happening in the state with student achievement, we know that that data is going to go right back to influencing policy. And you can see that that really already has with the development of ESSA in response to what was going on with No Child Left Behind. So you can see how that implementation goes. And you'll even see that the teacher implementation is going to ultimately have an effect on, what happens at the building level. And I did forget to mention that the building level, and I talked about it over here, but we know that the leadership style, the knowledge of the leader in the school, their experience and bias is going to affect the interpretation of policy and the district mission. And so what we know about implementation theory is that oftentimes, most of the time, that what is espoused at the state level gets reframed at the district level. So they interpret and reframe what they think they heard, and the district gives that to the schools, who then also interpret and reframe what they think they heard from the district, which then the teachers interpret and reframe. And so you can see how a state, a national policy curriculum framework can be reframed and interpreted down the levels to the point where it may or may not have the intent that was ultimately put in place for. And so therefore you may have instructional practices and outcomes that are not desirable. So all the more important for a curriculum leader to be working at this kind of granular level, be thinking about how is this curriculum being implemented? What are the immediate outcomes and what are the long-term outcomes? And is this actually doing what we set out to do? So we know for implementing curriculum, we've got several stakeholders. We talked about this last week. We want to make sure that as we are evaluating and implementing curriculum, that we're really keeping in mind the learner as a main stakeholder and really thinking about, what it is that the student is able to do as a result of this, implementation. So the role of the learner, right? We know that they are the center of the educational process and why school exists. So they are, in a sense, bringing the curriculum to life. The second you start a lesson, the second you start implementing the curriculum, it's going to interact with the learner. And that's really where you need to be thinking about it, if how is it working with them. We also need to know that they are the primary stakeholder in curriculum, and that the context of the learning, what environment, what sociocultural factors, what school factors are influencing how the learner is interacting with that curriculum. So this, kind of statement, this quote really, stands out to me, right? The success of the curriculum can only be measured by the extent of learning that the learners have achieved. Therefore, a fit between the planned or written curriculum and the characteristics of the learner will guarantee success in education. With that, we need to then think about the role of the teacher with implementation, right? So they're going to take that curriculum and create the experiences where students can learn those objectives. The teacher designs and enriches and modifies the curriculum to match the learner in front of them, which is what we want. We know that teachers will be involved in writing, selecting materials, and evaluating. So really, the teachers are the architects of the curriculum, right? And the curriculum is inactive until the teachers implement it. So the teachers really need to have professional development in order to become informed decision makers. And so we know that teachers will plan the curriculum, right? We think it's going to be an even kind of approach, but in reality, it often can have some bumps, hills, and valleys. So we want teachers to feel like they can navigate that successfully. So we know that over the past few decades, the role of the teacher in implementation of curriculum have shifted, right? And so some would argue that the teacher is at the root cause of failure to implement the curriculum properly. But if you think back to the graphic organizer I showed you on implementation, you kind of see that the root cause isn't necessarily the teacher. It's really on how the messages are shared and interpreted at each level. Here's just some quotes that students would have said about teachers being the most important component to curriculum development, and really, the resources that they can give their students. So we also know that technology is, something that is growing in our schools, but we know that it can never replace the teacher, right? The complexity of teaching requires a tremendous amount of maturity, decision making in the implementation of any curriculum plan in terms of choice of materials, method, strategy of teaching, and modes of evaluation are really going to depend on how the teacher is interacting with the students as they are teaching the curriculum. So in that model that we looked at previously, we saw how the knowledge and the leadership can influence the way teachers can interpret the message or the values for implementing a curriculum. So we know that they really play that important piece in terms of, the curriculum leader, right, influencing the management of the curriculum as well as the leadership in the district. And those leaders are responsible for vision, philosophy, mission, and setting the objectives. And then, of course, through that, they have to evaluate teachers and the program. If you think about when you are an administrator and you're sitting on an IEP team and a student is not successful with the curriculum, the principal or the school leader needs to be able to verify on the IEP that the student's need for specially designed instruction is not based on lack of instruction. So the obvious, we know that the administrators oversee that learning process. They ensure that there's a plan for transitioning year to year, as well as reducing redundancy of review. If you really study implementation, you will often see that teachers will repeat a high amount of content in the fall because they don't assume that the teachers in the year prior have done what they needed to do, or in the course prior. So we want to think about aligning not just across all third grade teachers or across all same course teachers. We want to make sure that they are articulating those learning outcomes from year to year. So it's just an important quote to think about the role of the administrator and how their responsibility and leadership is the institutional leadership really falls on that of the school administrator. So we also need to consider parents, and the kind of parents that you have in the schools, right? So you have this group of parents here, right? who are just kind of that, working with their child, right? You've got the overprotective parents, right, who are going to hover and protect their child forever. And then you've got the group of parents who are disenfranchised with the school, and all of these are coming to the school and with a different perspective, and their own experiences are shaping how they themselves are interacting with their children, and the outcomes that they are looking for from the schools. Yeah, and just another kind of piece of information to think about when you are considering parents and how they are shaping the curriculum. So we know we've got lots of parent education programs linked to parent involvement. We have the obvious PTAs or PTOs, home school organizations, and so we want to be thinking about how are we inviting parents to interact with the school program? Are we asking parents, is the communication sufficient enough around what is going on in the schools? What could we do better? How could we improve parent involvement? Sometimes we, as school educators, tend to approach parents like we know better instead of opening up the conversation to have them feel like they can offer some feedback to us that we can use to better the program. And of course, the community members are people that we need to also consider. So if you're working in a public school setting, we know that in many school districts, the majority of the taxpayers are not sending children to our schools. And so how do we then organize our community to feel that their tax dollars are worth what it is they are paying for? And so we can use the community as a resource and involve them in the school day-to-day curriculum. Again, I've just listed some, bullet points here for you to think about. And of course, the Department of Education is a great influence on our curriculum. And we know in Pennsylvania, PDE, we've got the PA core standards, we've got STEAM initiatives going on. We know that we've got the influence of the College Board with SAT, PSAT, and we've got national standards for social studies and CSS. We've got next generation science standards. We've got NCTE, NCTMs. So all of these kind of organizations are influencing what it is we are doing in our schools and how we are developing our curriculum frameworks. So we want to just talk about some models of implementation. So there's this overcoming resistance to change. There's leadership obstacle course. There's linkage model. There's organizational development and RAND change agent model. We can just kind of go through these one at a time for you to think about, right? We know we've got the overcoming resistance to change. And so the focus in this model is where we're really looking at overcoming that staff resistance, right? And so, we've got, people who say we've never done it that way. And those people are the ones who, you can see eventually that's not going to work. And so in that, and I think I talked a lot about this last week, so I don't want to get into it. We know that we're going to need to be able to show everyone in the organization why the change is important and how it will help. And I think in that, you also need to show, okay, here's what you did before, and here's what you're going to do differently. So actually being explicit about, do this, not this, and here's why, and here's how. And I think that why part is important for teachers to understand themselves so that they're not fearful that the students aren't going to get what they need to be successful. And so the leadership obstacle course model really kind of builds on that ORC model. And at this point, then would put the emphasis on that needs assessment as part of the curriculum development process, right? To determine what, but in this case, you're looking at what's the extent or the nature of the resistance of the teachers, so that you can then think about a plan ahead of time that you would be able to use. So you can see, I love this comic here, right? This idea that we go all tech, and yet sometimes simple tasks are still important, and I think that's important to keep in mind when you're dealing with teachers. We need to be able to explain why are we using this, not this, in order to teach more effectively. So just as an example of something that we did in our high school to get teachers to see in the English department how they could, the need for change in what they were doing. And so here was just a summary of our Keystone exam results. And you can see, we do pretty well. We've got, 88% of our students in 2018 either advanced or proficient. So you can see advanced is the blue, proficient is the green. Yellow is our basic, and red is our below basic. But when you look at the year prior, we actually decreased the number of advanced students, and we've increased the number of basic. And so getting the teachers to look at that and say, hey, what's going on? This was just our 10th graders in these two. This was just looking at everybody who tested. And you can see this was in 2015. And then what we did was we actually went ahead and looked at each area or reporting category of the assessments. So those of you not familiar with the high school Keystone, here's the overall score. Here was how they did on multiple choice. Here was our constructed response. And so you can see constructed response. We had 30% of our students who were not successful with the constructive response. So right there, the teachers kind of saw the need for working on that written part of the exam. Module 1, is all about literature. So you can see in Module 1, here's the overall score. And the anchor 1 and 2, both on literature. So this anchor 2 is all about analysis and interpretation, and this LF1 is all about author's purpose. And so I probably don't need to state the obvious here, is that this was an area that when we looked at our test scores needed to the most improvement on the Keystone exam. We could go further analyzing our results, by males and females. Again, not much of a difference except that we have more advanced females than males. We can look at it by poverty level. So the percentage of students who are not economically disadvantaged and how they scored compared to the economically disadvantaged. And you can see there's a big difference in the number of advanced students in that. We can look at it by ethnicity. And again, I think the results here are obvious. You can look at historically underperforming subgroups, which really starts to really show the disparity in the levels of advanced learning going on. We could do it by course level. So we can see our honor students, our college prep. This college prep with a little asterisk means that the class is co-taught with a learning support or reading specialist in our direct instruction. We can start to see what courses are working and what are not. We can compare by teacher. So in this case, there's 2 teachers who teach honors and they have very similar results. And this would probably indicate that our teachers are working collaboratively in their planning and in what they're doing in their classrooms, that they're getting the same results. Here you can look at it. This is our college prep, and here you can see there's a variation in the scores. And so we would start the conversation around what is teacher E doing that teachers C could learn from, and how can we strengthen them? So again, this is all about creating, data to show what it is that the need for the change, instead of telling them, it becomes less personal. We have the linkage model. This one really just focuses on kind of a continuous cycle of diagnosis, retrieval, formulation of solution, and kind of disseminating that out to teachers and staff, and then evaluating. So in this model, we know that the focus really is on the interactions of the teachers in looking at improving the operation of what's going on, and having that interaction and those folks really facilitate the idea of change. So it's kind of coming from within the organization versus top down. We actually have referenced the RAND model without actually naming it in the past few weeks, where we know that the success of implementation of program is really going to develop or depend on what's the nature of the change, right? And we need to be thinking about what's it actually going to ask people to do differently. We know that it's going to be important to think about what's the competency of the teaching and administrative staff. You can't put in a very complex or intricate curriculum or ask them to do something that's complex, and if you have a group of teachers who haven't been prepared to teach that way. So we really need to be looking at what level of teaching and leadership exists in the organization. We also have to think about, we've talked about the community before, and how you can't implement something if it's not going to be supported by those, whether it's parents, school board, or local community. And that could be something as controversial as evolution, right? That's a big one that gets debated depending on what community you're in. So you need to be thinking about that before you actually implement a course of study. And of course, the structure of the school. And when you get to the Tale of Two Schools activity, you're going to want to look at that lens of professional development and curriculum implementation, thinking about the structure of the school. So when thinking about the model of implementation, things that you're going to want to think about is what level of resistance do you think you're going to face? And how can you best kind of overcome that? You have to think about the type of dire change. Is this a whole pedagogy turnaround that you're really switching? How teachers have gone from let's say a stand and deliver type curriculum to more of a workshop type curriculum, and so that's a big change. That if people are not ready for that, that's going to be something that you're going to want to look at, perhaps that organizational development, right? Getting the teachers and the interactions within the building to think about how they might, introduce that idea of change. Your available expertise. So if you don't have knowledgeable experts as teacher leaders or as principals in your setting, it's going to be, challenging to implement something new or perhaps radical, or something that's going to require, kind of an everyday feedback kind of approach on helping others. And so we know if you think about teacher development, we know that in your first year or so of teaching, in those teachers, the learning really needs to be supported on a daily basis. And when you're going with a curriculum change or curriculum implementation, you're going to need someone to be there on a frequent basis. Otherwise, the teachers are going to want to give up and just revert back to what they already know. You're going to want to think about what funding you have, of course. If you have funding to bring in outside experts. A lot of times when you purchase materials from a company, you'll get that support of resources and people, as well as the materials that can come in and provide that. You also need to think about the urgency of the situation. So in the state of Pennsylvania right now, 8th grade math scores on the PSSA are not in a good place. I want to say 40 to 50% proficiency for the grade 8 PSSA. So, if you're a school district in Pennsylvania looking at implementing a new curriculum for your 8th grade, may be something that's more urgent than other curriculum areas. So the last thing that you're going to do in this unit is the Tale of Two Schools discussion board. And so you're going to want to think about some of the things that you've viewed and read this week, to think about how you would approach each school in your discussions. And so we'll kind of leave it at that. So, implementation strategies, you are going to want to think strategically. You're going to want to think about discussion and advice papers that are available related to curriculum implementation, or creating them yourself, right? So that you want to offer an opportunity for, how can you help by providing an opportunity for teachers to engage with others in discussion, create materials that help with implementation. You want to be thinking about sending perhaps teachers to conferences or seminar, or getting them available, connected to forums. So an example I'll use, when we implemented the units of study in reading and writing, K through 8, there are Facebook forums for teachers, and people post questions and responses all the time, and it's a great place to connect others. So that's a nice strategy to use. Twitter is another one. You can utilize your IU professionals. You think about how you can structure your professional development days. So when we implemented those units, as I mentioned before, we actually planned the year of professional development around unpacking the units and having a sequential rollout, so teachers didn't feel overwhelmed. We kind of broke out, let's focus on this goal, for this month. Once we get good at that, we'll move to the next step of implementation. We had working groups at each building level, and in that we actually provided substitutes. So we gave 2 hours a day per teacher, or 2 hours a month per teacher, to work as grade level teams on kind of unpacking the units of study. And so then they could work together as a team for that 2 hours of uninterrupted time on, okay, let's plan for now, let's kind of make a big plan for now to the next month. And I know the teachers really appreciated and valued that collaboration. You want to think about allowing teachers to observe other teachers, as well as site visits to other schools who may be perhaps using a similar curricular approach, and how best you can learn from them. One example that we used in those 2-hour professional developments that we had is we actually broke them up into groups. And so we had partner A look at the orientation to the unit of study, and then had to teach everybody else the big picture. Partner B would then read the table of contents and pacing of the unit, and be able to explain how the units been broken out by bends, how they're different from one another. And then the last partner had to skim actually the first lesson or session. And so then they taught each other, so that they all weren't reading everything start to finish, but they were dividing the work up and all getting the same understanding of what it is that they were going to be doing. And then the last thing was to decide what materials they needed, what assessments were they going to administer in order to know their students. So just want to end this video just refocusing us in on those essential questions, and having you reflect on, kind of looking back now, what types of experience have you had with curriculum implementation, and that, you're always, reflecting on what's working and what's not working in that implementation phase.